45.8%. That number wasn't just a tariff. It turned into a self-inflicted wound for the Trump administration. Trump imposed heavy tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber, hoping to force Canadian producers to accept U.S. terms. But Canada didn't beg for exemptions. Instead, it used this challenge to build a lumber industry that no longer depends on the American market. Today, we explain how Canada turned U.S. tariffs into a long-term economic strategy, why domestic Canadian policies are driving lumber prices up at home, why Canada is selling wood to Europe and Asia instead of the U.S., and how American housing affordability is now facing a deeper crisis. The U.S. government has significantly increased duties on Canadian lumber, including combined anti-dumping and countervailing tariffs that can total roughly 35% or more in many cases. These were meant to shrink Canadian lumber exports to the U.S., so American mills can capture more market share. But instead of capitulating, rather than asking Washington to lift the tariffs, Canada invested in its own industry. The government announced multi-billion-dollar support plans for lumber and steel industries to deal with U.S. tariffs. This is not temporary relief. It's meant to transform the industry. Programs focus on liquidity, financing, wage support, and market transition, so companies can survive and restructure. Instead of selling giant volumes into the U.S., Canadian producers are selling more into Canada's own market. Prices are higher there because mills are restructuring and domestic demand is guaranteed by policy and contracts. Redirecting exports to Europe and Asia, Western Canadian producers are pursuing new markets such as Japan, South Korea, and the UK, where tariffs don't apply and long-term relationships can form. This means less Canadian supply is available for U.S. builders than before. The U.S. housing market relies heavily on lumber. Historically, roughly one-third of softwood lumber used in the U.S. came from Canada. With higher tariffs and less Canadian supply, U.S. lumber prices climbed, which adds directly to construction costs. Builders face higher material costs that get passed to homebuyers. This worsens the housing affordability crisis. Even if American mills increase capacity, they can't fully replace the volume Canada used to supply. That mismatch between demand and domestic supply keeps pressure on prices. Instead of limping along hoping tariffs disappear, Canada used this moment to strengthen its domestic lumber base, create resilience to future trade tension, expand into new international markets, build a system where Canadian demand helps sustain the industry, as Canada's leadership said in late 2025, the era of relying on a single trade partner is ending, and the country is pivoting to greater economic self-sufficiency and resilience. Trump's tariffs were intended to protect American lumber mills. Instead, they forced Canada to restructure its lumber industry, reduced Canadian lumber supply to the U.S., helped create a diversified and resilient Canadian market, contributed to higher lumber costs in the U.S. housing sector, drove Canada toward global markets that don't weaponize trade policy in that sense. Canada didn't just survive the tariffs. It used them to build an industry that no longer needs